Welcome back to Forbidden Knowledge News. I'm your host, Chris Matthew, and tonight I'd like to welcome U.S. Marine in the Secret Space Program, Captain Randy Cramer. How you doing tonight, Randy?
I'm good. I'm in Washington State right now, and we're in a bit of a cold snap, so it's in the 20s. So burr, but I'm good.
Yeah, and you're in an interesting situation tonight. I understand you don't have good connection in your house, so are you actually broadcasting from your car there?
I am. I'm actually piggybacking on the Wi-Fi of a restaurant that I go to all the time that has pretty decent Wi-Fi. And my roommates, who are wonderful people, don't believe in having Wi-Fi in the house. So if I could plug in a hard line to my phone, which I can't, then that would work. And my laptop is really just an antique, and it doesn't do my Zoom very well. It doesn't do my Skype very well. I lose audio all the time, and so I've just given up trying to use it to do audio, video, conference calls and interviews on my computer because it's just a piece of crap. So yeah, that's the situation we're at. So I'm a little shadowy in my image there, but I'm here, I promise.
Yeah, like I said, we're going to make it work. And Randy has a fascinating story. I don't know if any of my subscribers have heard this, but we're going to delve deep into it. We're going to get to as much as possible in the time we have. But first, for those who aren't familiar with the Secret Space Program in general, Randy, could you give us a little, just a brief overview of what the 20 and Back program entails?
Well, it's been pretty standard for some decades using Sarcoma program activity. Oh, hold on. Can you hear me here? You look like you're...
Yeah, you froze up there for a second. I can hear you now, though.
I think I just have bad connection. Let's see if I pull forward a couple of feet, if that helps. I might get an extra bar out of that. So it's pretty standard fare for a number to get the maximum value of personnel to do a 20-year tour. So, and for most people who aren't quote unquote volunteers for these programs, they have to reinsert you back into the timeline that they took you from to relive your life without sort of missing that 20 years. So in my case, I was taken away from my tour of duty when I was 17 years old at about 2:30 a.m. in the morning, and was returned both 20 years later and 15 minutes later at 2:45 the same night. So they go through a process which they progression. My understanding of the process is they actually hatch out a fresh clone body for you, age it up to the age that they took you from, stick your entire consciousness and your spiritual soul being, which they can do. I know that may sound weird to some people if that's the first time they're hearing this, can be extracted from your body as a vessel and put into another vessel, and they put it into another copy of yourself and then return you 15 minutes later, so you wake up the next day feeling like you had a really long, I'm here again. So you just kind of presume in your brain and your body that you're just right back where you started from, even though there are some residual repressed memories that kind of bleed through almost immediately, but without a linear context, it doesn't make any sense. So I didn't really start to get what I would say a barrage of linear memories for almost a decade after that, which was just very confusing at the time. And then it took another decade really to get what I would call total recall, where I have recovered and recall every memory, my entire experience, frontward to back, from day one to the last day, or at least is the best that most people can recall a 20-year period of time or a 20-year tour of duty.
So how old were you when you had that total recall?
I was about 37.
You said you were about 37?
Correct, about 37 years old. So it was about 20 years after I did my tour, which I've spoken to a lot of people. I get emails from people all the time who are having difficulties recovering memories and are asking me for guidance in that area. And it's a similar kind of process for a lot of people. A lot of people start to get their memories between sort of 10, 12 years after their tour, and people who have gone about another almost 20 years post their tour, if they've done some work on it, have regained a large chunk of their memories by that time. Some people, though, if they haven't done the personal memory recall process, whether that's either hypnotic regressions or personal meditative theta state regressions, then I've known people in their late 30s, early 40s, late 40s who are still extracting memories from their experiences. So depends on at what point you decide to dive into it and chew up that shit pizza.
So most people that have gone through this program, or a lot of them, are MyLab victims. They're abducted from a young age and kind of groomed for the program. But your experience was a little different, is that right?
Correct. United States Marine Corps Special Section in the mid-'60s did a study on the effects of these sort of, what do we call it, the trauma-based mind control techniques, which trained a lot, that it was very ineffective to the lifespan and effectiveness of the personnel that were being trained or persecuted that way, really. So they came up with another idea and suggested some changes, which a number of agencies at the table rejected and decided that they didn't want to change that they'd rather have murder machines that they could snap their fingers who would kill on command. And so USMCSS started its own program and started training its soldiers using what we simply call a with the grain technique, which instead of trying to break people in order to make them pliable, it uses deep subliminal messaging and programming from an early age to essentially train them as better soldiers, which better soldiers really, their goal is not to just murder people. Their goal is to complete a mission while using lethal force if necessary and not necessarily just murdering people at the snap of a finger. So that's a basic gist of it. I could go into quite a bit more detail about that, but for the sake of time, we'll just call that simplicity, the simple answer.
So what about your personal experience? I mean, you were, I guess you could say, grown in a sort of petri dish?
Well, yeah. I mean, I was engineered from the ground up. So my DNA was, segments of my DNA were taken from my mother, from my father, put together like most people are normally, but then my DNA sequence was laid out and the parts that they wanted to take out were removed. And then they put in some extraterrestrial DNA sets and wound that up again into the nuclei of the cells and put me back into my mother's womb where I was gestated and then born.
So what age do you remember any type of training that you went through?
I can remember training as early as about age 4.5, like really, really young, like able to, motor, walk, and move, but not in any way what I would say. I mean, most 4-year-olds aren't really hand-eye coordinated. So we weren't, practicing martial arts at that age or practicing with rifles or pistols at that age, but we were practicing group activities, learning how to work as a team, hide and seek, things that, were training the brain and the body and training us how to work as a group and as a unit. So very early training like that was not so militaristic so much as it was behavioralistic.
So I assume your combat training started at a little bit a later age?
Probably by about 6 or 7.
Wow.
So by the time a 6 or 7-year-old can, has the hand-eye coordination to start learning martial arts and the ability to start handling tools and weapons. So we started learning, probably about 6.5, not, before 7 years old.
Now, did you have like a normal family situation?
Oh, absolutely. The training periods, you're taken away at night and then brought back. Again, typical fare is 15 minutes after you're left. So there are trace amounts of time travel that are involved in this. So my parents had no idea until I gave them a briefing on this for about 7 years ago. So now my mother and father both did say when I gave them that briefing, oh, that makes a lot of things make sense. So there were ripples, throughout my childhood that gave them the impression that something unusual was going on. But in the same way that my waking memories didn't have a linear experience to connect the dots to, neither did they. So most people, when you have weird anomalous things occurring and you don't have a linear set of dots to connect, your brain tends to just reject any unusual explanations and go for something that's much more mundane or normal, because you don't want to be too weird or too crazy as far as most other people are concerned. So our brain tends to normalize our own socialization based on the world that we live in.
So were you, I guess, basically aware at the time that you were being taken at night?
I had residual memories of experiences during the day that I just couldn't, again, put all the dots together. So, and I knew that I wasn't supposed to talk about any of these things, and I was also inhibited from talking about it. There were times when I felt like I wanted to try and say something, or I wanted to try and talk about it to someone, but would literally open my mouth and be unable to make words. So even it didn't take long in my youth before I just simply gave up trying to communicate about it, because I understood that even when I did try to talk about these things, I was physically incapable of doing so. So I didn't talk about it because I couldn't, but again, mostly because you don't have this complete dots to connect of memories. It's residual things, residual impressions, flashes, the ability to do things biomechanically. The first time that as a very young child, that I exhibited the ability to just automatically perform a act of physical self-defense, I was as shocked, I think, as anybody else who was watching what happened, because I had no idea from that point of experience to understand how in the world how I learned martial arts without training without going to classes that I remembered taking, basically. So I had the residual memories of it. I knew there was something there, but again, without a linear set of dots to connect, I was just as eager in my frontal lobe to go, no, there's nothing to that, as anybody else would be, because I didn't want to be abnormal or unusual. I really just wanted to be normal like everybody else, and accepting that there was something more going on with those residual memories, or the dreams that I would have that were essentially replays of some of those events and some of those training exercises. That would have just meant that I was not like everybody else, and I didn't want to not be like everybody else. So I didn't even want to go there as far as my frontal lobe was concerned.
And how do you know that these memories aren't just implanted or screen memories that were placed there?
That's a fair question. And I will say that the answer to that is, over time, as in my late 20s, when it started to become more and more clear that there was something more, as these memories became more vivid, more consistent, more dots to connect, I undertook a very serious process to get to the bottom of these memories by diving into my subconscious and extracting them. And I spent thousands of hours for several years in deep meditative states with a mantra that was, I want the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, no matter what. And I would often come up from a deep meditative experience with a set of memories, and I would look at that and go, you know what? No. And I would immediately reject that those memories that I was recalling were true, and I would do it again the next day, and again the next day. And sometimes I would spend an entire week or 2 weeks going over the same area of memories again and again and again, with what I would say a scrutinous self-doubt, so that by the time I got to the end of that process of gathering one set of memories, and they were consistent every time, and they didn't change every time, and they were as vivid and real and visceral as any other memory that I've ever had about anything, my only conclusion was that they had to be legit and had to be real. Now, I will say, as far as talking about screen memories, there occasionally would, in this process, a false or a screen memory come up, but in a deep state, screen memories don't last. They don't really hold up to any scrutiny. They actually appear two-dimensional. So they fall apart, they fall down, and when you push on a screen memory, you get to the real memory behind it. So someone who doesn't push to a screen memory is not going to necessarily get to the real memory, but I pushed and I pushed and I pushed and I pushed on every memory until I was absolutely certain that it was something legitimate that was happening or had happened to my experience.
Very interesting. And what age did you say you first actually went to Mars?
That was when I was 17.
Now, did they approach you and say, "Hey, you're going to be going to Mars now," or did it just happen? How did that happen?
Well, I certainly had been trained for years, enough to know that at some point I was going to get deployed. And by that age, training sessions would typically occur when a couple of technicians would come through essentially a wormhole in the wall of my bedroom. A light, a sort of a yellowish, greenish, bluish light would kind of appear in the room, and I would sit up, and these two technicians would come out of the wormhole, the localized wormhole, a door in the wall, if you will, and would, escort me through to a situation where I would go through a training exercise. So when I was deployed, the same sort of exercise of having this wormhole open up in the wall and having two technicians step out was completely normal for me at that point, and I just walked through like every other experience. But by the time I got to Luna Operations Command and was having a contract put out in front of me and having a junior officer explain to me that I had to sign and initial this contract, and that then I was actually going for a deployment, then I knew I was being deployed. But up until that point, I just presumed that, like every other situation that I had been through like that, it was just another training exercise. But yeah, it wasn't. It was, oh, we're actually deploying you somewhere now. And I didn't no one told me. The junior officer who we filled out the contract with, he didn't tell me I was going to Mars. He just said, well, when I asked him the question, I was like, well, where am I going? He's like, well, I actually can't tell you that. It's classified. But, I can tell you that you have to sign and initial this entire contract, and then, you'll be informed of where you're going to go, which he still didn't inform me of where I was going to go. We had to wait until we got aboard the transport ship, and the transport ship actually took off to through another larger wormhole from Earth orbit to Mars orbit, and then the captain of the ship said, "Welcome to Mars." That was actually the first moment that I knew where I was going.
Now, was this your physical body, or did they just transfer your consciousness to a clone?
Oh no, this was my physical body, absolutely.
So when did the consciousness transfer, when did that occur?
That was on the return trip. So after I'd served my 20-year tour, came back to Luna Operations Command. I'm 37 years old at that point, but they got to send me back to 1987. If I had woken up a 37-year-old man in my bed at 17, that would have been awkward for everyone. So at that point, they decided to hatch, from the process as I understand it, they hatched out a 17-year-old clone, stuck me into that, and then returned me back to my bed.
Okay, so you went through a portal, and where did you end up on the other side of the portal initially? On the moon?
Well, actually, it was to a facility I want to say was somewhere in the American Southwest, and we boarded a TR-3B, which is the black triangle ships. Right. And then from there, we went to the moon, which is about a 90-minute trip. And again, I'm guessing the location because as we took off and left Earth, I was actually sitting next to a window, and I could look out and see where we were leaving from. So I couldn't tell, from the geography exactly where we were. But as we started to get higher and higher, I was like, oh, okay, that looks like we just took off from New Mexico or something like that. And then again, about 90 minutes later, got to the facility at Luna Operations Command at the landing bay there.
How long did you spend on the moon?
It was a couple of days, maybe. It was basically just long enough to get a physical, psych eval, sign the contract, and then get put on a transport ship. So it was maybe a couple of days. We were underground the entire time, didn't have access to clocks. There was no windows with sun or daytime or nighttime. So it's a guess that it was about 2 days, but I couldn't really be for sure about that.
Now, who's behind all this? Who's running? Is it like a bunch of nations? Are we cooperating with ETs to run this whole space program?
Well, certainly in the early days, we had a lot of help from extraterrestrial friends and neighbors who helped us establish the programs and build the ships and design them and build the programs that we were building. But currently, and certainly by the time that I was deployed, the program was just a multinational contingent of countries who are, we would say, traditional, while and it's the G7 now, we would still consider these sort of G8 countries, the technologically advanced countries who were participating in the program at the time, continue to participate in that program and are the backbone of the Earth Defense Force and the Covert Military Space Program, which is, not just a United States program, not just the U.S. and Great Britain or the US and Great Britain and Germany. It's, again, all of those G8 countries. Plus, we have started to let some of the other countries that we might consider sort of up to the G20 now into the program. So most of those other countries don't necessarily build a lot of their own ships, but they are having officers, pilots, and personnel who are participating in the program so they can benefit technologically from being in the program overall.
Did you encounter a lot of German influence?
Not a lot where I was at. So the Nachtwaffen, which is German for Night Fleet, which is the Dark Fleet, which is run by the Neuschwabenlanders, who, for anyone who doesn't know that, the Neuschwabenlanders were the quote-unquote German Nazis who left Germany, went down to Antarctica to a little piece of land that they had carved out and established in the late 30s called Neuschwabenland. And legally on paper, they stopped being the Germans, they stopped being the Nazis, and they became the Neuschwabenlanders. So when the United Nations allowed them a secret chair that they didn't release to the public, they did not call them the Germans or the Nazis, they were called the Neuschwabenlanders. And so they tend to call themselves the Neuschwabenlanders, and that's what we tend to call them. So, but because they tend to operate their own fleet, no, we were not a part of that. I wasn't part of that fleet. I was with either contracted in the MDF or in the Radiant Guardian fleet, which is, let's just say, pretty thin on German dialects.
What ET races were we friendly with on Mars?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer. We were certainly, there's 4, 5, maybe 6 different indigenous species on Mars. I'm not familiar enough with all of them to talk about all of them. I was in regular contact through combat operations with the indigenous insectoid species and the indigenous reptoid species. So I know quite a bit about them, but I don't know too much about the other species that are present there because we simply didn't encounter them. I'm not sure what other friendly species we may have been working with because I never saw them or had any contact with them. And later on, when I was a pilot and had more contact with other extraterrestrial species, that was just sort of a whole nother experience later on after my tour in the MDF. So as far as that question, I honestly don't know what species we were cooperating with on Mars. That's one I don't really have the answer to, just because I wasn't exposed to any of the ETs that we would have been cooperating with.
Okay. And yeah, I'd like to get to some specific races that I have in mind a little later. But can you describe the landscape, the atmosphere, what it felt like, what the air was like on Mars?
Well, the gravity is quite a bit lower, so you kind of bounce around a lot when you're trying to walk, and we were in a powered body armor, which is like a hydraulic exosuit, essentially. So learning how to walk in that thing and walking in the lower gravity is this whole other experience. The air is fairly thin. We were up north where the air is even thinner and colder. So you could pop up your helmet, but you couldn't really breathe for a long period of time or get into a kerfuffle or a fight and be able to breathe heavily in the native atmosphere. But it was oxygen-oriented, and you certainly could breathe in it. It had a smell typically of rust because the iron oxide is everywhere, is just covers the ground all over the place, and so you have this rusty smell in the air. But again, that sense of the change in gravity, being literally physically lighter, weighing less weight, almost less than half your normal body weight, while still having your same body mass and your same muscular power, is a really strange sensation. Anyone who's ever had I've had dreams like this, but maybe that's why. Anyone who's ever had dreams of, being able to take really big steps and feeling like you're lighter, like maybe you could get lift off, but not quite. It's kind of like that. You really just feel, it feels otherworldly. I mean, for lack of a better word, you just, because you're just not at all feeling the same pull of gravity on your legs, your feet, your stomach, your blood vessels. And so everything just feels a little weird, a little ephemeral, because there's this sense of lightness because of the lower gravity.
Very interesting. Now, were your bases underground or above ground?
Absolutely underground. We were at a station at least on our maps, the most northerly outpost that we had, and it was inside a mountain. There were pretty large doors that went into the motor pool, which was the sort of the initial landing bay that we would go enter to the base into, and everything else was deep into this mountain.
And where exactly? You said you were on the northern part of Mars?
Yeah, the maps that we looked at, I couldn't tell you exactly where it was. Like, if I pulled up a map of Mars, I couldn't tell you exactly where it was. I could tell you about the longitude and say it was kind of about here. So usually what I tell people is it would be the equivalent of like being in Alaska. So we were pretty far north, but obviously not all the way to the equator, to the pole, but clearly not anywhere near the equator. We weren't up as far as the pole, nowhere near the equator. We were way farther north. It was cold. It would snow from time to time, which is another strange experience because of the gravity difference. The snow would fall very, very, very slowly, almost like in slow motion. It was an eerie and yet very cool thing to observe, to watch the snowfall there.
Can you describe your weapons, your body armor, your gear? What kind of weaponry and gear were you using?
So the gear was basically a powered armor body, full body powered armor suit, which was called the Archer series, which depending on what year it was that we were there would depend on which number followed that. The first body armor that I stepped into was something called the Archer 119, and the last one I believe was the Archer 249. It was a hydraulically powered suit, so that you could jump farther, lift things stronger. I mean, we've already got half gravity, so you've already got super strength and super jumping power without powered body armor on. Add hydraulically powered body armor, and you can throw things farther and jump even farther. And the major weapon that we used was a Gauss rifle or a railgun, so it was a magnetically propelled projectile out of a rifle that had a connection to a power source in the suit for the most part.
Now, are we the invaders there? Are we fighting indigenous species?
Yeah, we kind of are. Interestingly enough, the indigenous species don't necessarily consider us invaders. They consider us neighbors, but neighbors that you have disagreements with, which is a little bit different than the attitude they would have from an invading force, which I go into some detail into my book. There was a draconian invasion about 9 years into my tour, and that just became a very different event as far as how we dealt with it, how the indigenous dealt with it. But essentially, we are still more of an invader there than we are not. I mean, we showed up and said, yeah, we're just going to put in some colonies, we're going to build some bases, and we're going to kick the crap out of anybody that's too close to our territory. Which, from what people read my book when it's out, which is going to be soon. we'll get the larger narrative there, but we didn't exactly have to be in conflict with the indigenous species. It was pretty much just to keep testing military hardware.
Very interesting. And
So they weren't overtly hostile. They were defensive because, you know, we've got guys on the ground with armor and guns and, you know, attacking anybody who came close to us. So that sort of starts the whole conflict, but they weren't outrightly hostile, let's just say.
Now, what were these species? What were the indigenous species that you were encountering?
An indigenous insectoid species and an indigenous reptoid species. The indigenous insectoids were, so there's a king of the hive, which is male, not female, so it's not a queen, which is like the size of an elephant. And then the drones themselves are about like a giant ant that's about 5.5 feet tall. But they typically didn't do a lot of the fighting themselves. They engineered these other bugs. So there's these swarms of beetles anywhere from the size of a hedgehog to a medium-sized dog that they would use essentially as their fighting forces, as well as a couple of bigger ones like about a 18 or 20 foot long centipede with mandibles 3 feet wide.
And you said these beings look like,
pretty terrifying fighting insects like that.
You said these beings looks like ants. Were they standing on
kind of like they stand on 2 legs. They have 6 appendages, and they have 2 in the middle, 2 on the bottom that they stand on, and 2 on the top that typically operate as their main arms or hands. And the 2 in the middle could be either or. So if they needed extra support while walking, they could use that 3rd or 4th limb to steady themselves, or they could use 4 arms to carry something or operate or build something. So the two in the middle could sort of be top or bottom depending on their need.
Now, was this an intelligent species? Did they communicate?
Very. Highly intelligent psionic species, meaning they have the ability to communicate telepathically directly if they choose to. Very, very intelligent, super intelligent. Just a little different than the way our mammalian intelligence works, but incredibly intelligent beings, for sure. And the indigenous reptoids were also highly intelligent. We were led to believe they were sort of a savage reptile, but they were also, again, quite intelligent.
And can you describe the reptoid species?
Sure. The reptoid species tended to be anywhere from about 5.5 feet tall to almost 7.5 feet tall. And, you know, from the sort of stocky, beefy side to the very large, beefy side. And they had skin tones that were, I would say, sort of these sandy colors, like a sandy brown, a sandy red, sandy tan color. And then they had markings on their heads, on their backs, and on their arms that were, any people are familiar with terrestrial lizards or terrestrial reptiles, if I say a rock lizard, that's probably the best kind of description I can give. So the color patterns tended to be in spots of black, yellow, red, brown, tan, and sort of those sort of primary colors.
Did they have sort of elongated snouts or more of a short snout?
Actually, a very short snout. The draconians have a very long snout, more like a crocodile or an alligator. The indigenous reptoids on Mars have a short snout very close to their face. Sticks out a couple inches, but not much farther than that.
And the draconians, were they much larger than the indigenous reptoids?
Yes. They well, not necessarily much larger. The big 7.5 footers are pretty big. But I would say the typical draconian was more like between 6 and 8 feet.
And those are the more of elongated snouts, and did they have wings?
Some of them do, some of them don't. So it really depends on I think some of their social class or social standing that has to do with how, you know, their genetic origins or their purpose on the battlefield.
And you said that the Draco kind of invaded a little later in your stay?
Correct. About 9 years, 8.5, 9 years into my tour.
And from what I hear from a lot of whistleblowers, the Draco try to get their hands in a lot of things and possibly have a lot of control on what's happening on Earth right now.
Well, they used to have control on what was going on here on Earth, but that really started to be arrested from them about 20 years ago. And I would say between the last 10 and 20 years, most of that control was taken away. And within the last 5 years, they really have no real social political control at this time. I'm not saying that there aren't still a few lollygaggers around that we're still dealing with, but for the most part, they are a more of a nuisance than they are anything else at this point.
So they wouldn't have anything to do with, say, the cabal. That's that everybody would see as the Illuminati or what you would
Again, they used to be, but they wouldn't. I wouldn't say that they represent that force anymore. Now, what happens though in these power vacuums, just because we eliminated the draconian presence or threat, or for the most part, the majority of it, doesn't mean that some other species took the opportunity to make a deal with the cabal and start working with them. So there's, we've always got somebody giving us trouble that we have to deal with. And there's always somebody willing to make a deal with another species for power technology or some tactical advantage that they think is going to suit their needs. So that continues to be an issue, but again, it's not with the Draconians. Now, I have been told by some people who served in the Nachtwaffen that the white Dracos do serve with some of the Schwabenlanders and with the Nachtwaffen, but the white Dracos are a faction of Draconians. So they are actually in a state of civil war, like a number of species. The Zeta reticulans, for example, when we talk about them, there isn't just like one group of Zetas. There's 5 different groups, and they divide themselves into sort of 2 sides that are in a state of civil war with each other. And from what I understand, the white Dracos are also in a state of civil war with their darker green cousins.
Very interesting.
I don't know enough about that to explain that much more. That's just what people who know a bit more about that have told me. I wish I knew more about that, but I just don't.
So getting back to your experience on Mars, now I assume you've been through quite a few battles, is that right?
Yeah, several thousand combat events.
What was your first battle experience like? Were you terrified?
At first, yeah. But they have this drug cocktail that is shot into your leg in a hypodermic pack that essentially takes away your fear, elevates your aggression, and not having been acclimated to the drug cocktail, my first experience was essentially to leap down the hill and scream and charge into battle and go rather ballistic, as it were, because it's a powerful drug cocktail. It again, it elevates your aggression levels and reduces your fear experience. So you stop feeling afraid and you just feel like you just want to fight and attack and kill anything that's in front of you.
What was your first battle with? Was it with the reptoids?
It was with the indigenous reptoids, correct.
And were you ever severely injured or, have any trauma?
Oh, I was severely injured a lot. So I've had, fingers, hands, arms, legs ripped off, blown off, bitten off, burned off, stabbed, other parts of my body, holes poked in them and ripped apart. Luckily, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you want to look at it, we had a very advanced medical technology, which is essentially a holographic cellular regenerating bed that projects a high-resolution hologram of your genetic profile onto your body, which tells the cells in your body to regrow to their optimal state, and or fools the nuclei of your cells to grow back down to your fingertips, your toes, if you've had limbs missing. So it's has the ability to completely restore your physical body to 100%. So we get injured from anything from a little injury or a finger ripped off to, right arm and my left arm and my left leg ripped off, my guts torn open, and half my face torn off, and then put back together in a matter of hours or days, depending on the severity of the injury.
Now, you weren't traumatized by any of that?
Horribly traumatized. Horribly traumatized. I have said more than once that it was a 20-year tour of duty and it was a 20-year healing process. I'm a lot better now, but if you knew me 20 years ago, I was a mess. I mean, my emotional, I was a real piece of work, to be honest with you. So experienced a lot of depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, insomnia over the years, had sleep disorders for decades. I mean, I spent decades not being able to get a good night's sleep for years and years and years. But I seriously undertook the process of getting to my memories, and in that process, as I would remember things, would re-experience that trauma, and essentially would have to do pretty deep healing work on those memories as I went through them one at a time to get through that trauma, just so I could get to the next set of memories.
Now, do they have the technology to basically bring you back to life, and did you ever die?
Yes. So there's a sort of an interesting gray line there. If there's enough electrical activity in your brain to keep silver cord connected, retrieval, or you are retrievable. And if that connection breaks, then you become unretrievable, and then you actually die for real. But you can be damaged so badly that your consciousness leaves your body and goes into a near-death experience, and you essentially experience what you would experience if you die, which is a bit of a life review and an experience of communicating with guides or other dimensional beings that talk about your existence in your material life and whether you're ready to move on or whether you're done. And I would always say, no, I'm not done. I have to go back. And then they would say, well, okay, then go back the way you came in. And then I would end up back in my body at some point. But yes, I have experienced a quote-unquote near-death or death experience dozens of times.
So they just, I guess, have your consciousness on hand?
No, it just, as long as there's a connection still to your body, it will come back into your body, or they can pull it back into your body. But if, again, that silver cord that connects us to our body is actually severed, then it's like a kite with a string being cut, and you're just gone.
Wow. Very interesting. And now I understand you were actually a pilot for some spacecraft.
At the end of my tour in the MDF, after 17 years, I was given a promotion, got to go to flight school, and then, spent the end of my 20-year tour as a pilot of an air wing on the EDF SS Nautilus.
Now, can you describe that ship?
The Nautilus?
Yes.
It was probably, I want to say, at least a mile long or almost a mile long. It's broken up into 3 sections. The front section is the command section. The middle section is the flight deck section, and the rear section is the engineering section. Now, there was a door at the engineering section that said specifically, do not enter, and since I was not an engineer, I was not allowed in the engineering section, so I can't tell you exactly how big it is or what was in there because I was never allowed in. I was allowed in the command section by escort by a senior officer, maybe a dozen times, but I spent almost my entire time in the flight deck section. And when you're looking at the ship from the outside, from space, it looks really big, but again, without, something to compare it to, I'm giving my best guesstimate of what I understand is the length of these vehicles and these ships to be about a mile or just short of a mile long.
And what were the controls like? Was it as similar to anything we have here on Earth? Was it completely different?
I was never allowed on the flight deck. On the actual, the bridge, the command section. So I would not know how that ship is actually flown. The control mechanisms for the planes that we flew, which are not planes at all, but we call them planes, which are essentially a electrogravitic, magnetogravitic propelled vehicle that's shaped kind of like a cone, that's pointy in the front and sort of roundish and flat in the back with a kind of a flat bottom. Those controls were a sphere in front of us where the stick would be, with hand imprints in them. So your hands, left and right hand, would fit into the indentations in the sphere, and you would spin, tilt, and swirl the sphere. And then there were buttons at your fingertips that you use to control the mechanisms of the vehicle. As well as a slider in the seat. The seat also has a slider, so when you slip your hips left and right, it would sort of quickly strafe the vehicle side to side.
Did you ever encounter
very nimble? I just want to point out the very nimble vehicle. That control mechanism gives you a lot of agility.
Very interesting. Now, did you encounter any biological vehicles or maybe artificially intelligent?
Not in my experience, not what we flew, but I did talk to enough people about other ships that were in the fleet that had more complicated artificial intelligence and/or in some cases organic computing systems or organic life systems. Those always sounded really intriguing to me, but my understanding was we're still sort of an experimental stage with those types of vehicles, or they weren't considered reliable enough to mass manufacture for the fleet. So we were getting what was considered sort of the best vehicle that they could mass manufacture for everyone. But I'd heard of a few vehicles that did use some very interesting, more integrative mechanisms with a artificial intelligence or organic, in some cases not a computer intelligence, but an actual organic intelligence that operated the vehicle or that you connected with to operate the vehicle.
Now, have you ever been to any other planets besides Mars and the Moon?
Not that I would be at liberty to discuss at this time.
Very interesting. Okay. So did you ever get any kind of breaks or vacations, anything like that?
On the Nautilus, every once in a while, we would pull into a station or a base and get to have essentially a Liberty weekend, and could any from 1 to 3 days where we could go off, quote unquote, on shore or off, to which is, again, you're in space. But, and sometimes there would be the equivalent of, for lack of a better word, bars, restaurants, some sort of what I would say, PG-13 level entertainment. I heard some other senior officers talking about some more R-rated entertainment that we didn't get to go to, but we did occasionally get to go to a bar and drink. So, that was usually we felt like that was reward enough if we could just go get hammered for a couple days.
Was this bar on Mars?
No, these were facilities at different stations or bases around the solar system.
Very interesting. Now, did they serve, regular alcohol, or did you have any kind of strange space drinks?
I was told that there were facilities that were mixed, meaning that they had both human personnel, terrestrial personnel, and extraterrestrial personnel, but we weren't allowed in those places, so we had to go to sort of the human-only bars. So it was all stuff that, you're used to drinking here. So beer, wine, and, whiskey, tequila, gin, vodka, the regular poisons.
How many extraterrestrial species have you personally encountered?
Well, since as part of my duties when I was aboard the Nautilus was to occasionally accompany ambassadorial corps to these away missions to the intergalactic space station that orbits around Jupiter, which is quite large. It's about, it's probably about a mile in diameter. The floor to ceiling, it's about 80 feet with windows that go 360 degrees all the way around. And it's a massive meeting room for both ourselves and other species having treaty and contract negotiations for the most part. And that room was almost always pretty full. So on any given visit to that station, we would encounter the species that we were there to talk to directly. And then within, 10, 30 feet could be another dozen or 2 dozen species or more that were close enough by for me to look at, stare at, look at, observe, kind of staring around the room, but not necessarily interact with to know much more about them other than what they looked like. So I've encountered dozens and dozens of species on those missions. I don't even know where I would begin to calculate the actual number given the size of that room. Easily, in fact, I'd say well over 100 or 200 species that I have seen, personally witnessed on that station.
Now, there's a lot of, I guess, misinformation and confusion about what the Anunnaki actually are. Have you ever encountered anything that you would call Anunnaki?
That's a good question. Having done a bit of my historical research on that, there seems to be, I mean, I'm speculating just from the historical research that I've done and the people that I've talked to about it, that when we talk about the ETs that we were dealing with in Sumeria, it was not just one species. Right. So the Anunnaki might be one species, but we were probably actually dealing with, you know, a half a dozen or maybe up to a dozen different species at that time. But they were just all sort of referred to as, quote unquote, the gods. And depending on where they were and what their description was, would sort of indicate sort of what those species were. So, for instance, the Mesoamericans have Quetzalcoatl, who is obviously a reptile, but you also have the Egyptians, the ancient Egyptians, which had these large, gigantic deities that they made these giant statuary of, and these temples with these doors that are, 60, 70 feet high so that they could walk through them. My understanding is that the sitting deities in Egypt that are, more than 60 feet tall, those make them bigger than life, but they were actually that tall.
Now, for all of this, do you have any type of paperwork or files or anything that you can show that's physical proof of this?
I have a dog tag implant behind my left ear that I have shown to a number of people, and I have talked to a couple of surgeons about getting removed. And it should have we should be able to look at it under an electron microscope, and it should have some writing on it. But that's a pricey cost at this point to essentially rent out the facility. I mean, I've talked to a couple of surgeons, and we can't just do it at their, in their living room. So the fee for what it would cost to rent out a day surgery facility is thousands of dollars. So when we've come up with the money, I have every intention of getting it taken out so that I can get it looked at under an electron microscope. I am in the process of filing paperwork to get my files, to get that paperwork. And I'm presuming, as Brigadier has instructed me, that once we get this dog tag implant out, that I can use that to some of the personnel that I'm attempting to get that paperwork from as proof that, I am who I am and was who I was and work for who I work for, I say I do. But at this point, the answer to that, the short answer is no. I just have this dog tag implant behind my ear. Well, I have one behind each ear. You can only see the one behind the left. And I intend to get that one taken out. But no, I don't have any paperwork at this time. But we are in the process of getting that paperwork.
Now, for the last few minutes, I'd like to get your take on what you think about Trump's Space Force. Is this just kind of a way to announce that we've always had a secret space program? Or what do you think's going on there?
Well, it's certainly, instead of just coming out and telling the truth that we've had a covert military space program for decades, it allows a changing and control of a different narrative. So it gives us the opportunity to say 6 months, 12 months, 18 months down the road, oh, look at this new cool jet fighter that we have that happens to also fly out in space. Oh, we just developed that a few years ago when maybe we've had that for, 50 years. So it does give us room to start talking about things, room to start talking about technology. It gives us the ready opportunity if there's a hoax invasion to have a response to that hoax invasion, that we don't just have to pull out from underneath a rock. We can say, oh, no, we've had the Space Force now. We've been working on that for a few months. We've got some tools. We got some toys. We're not completely defenseless. So it enables us to control the narrative in a different way and not have to admit everything that we know is true for the past 7 decades is true. But it all remains to be seen how that's going to be used because it can be used any way. It can be used any number of ways depending on who decides how it's going to be used. So we're just going to have to wait and see how that turns out. Let's just cross our fingers and hope it's all for the best.
Do you see disclosure anytime in the near future?
We've been seeing developments occur that would suggest that it's been on the cusp of happening for years, and that there just continues to be these delays in the decision-making process by those who have to actually implement it. I would suggest that we're closer than ever, but because, as I'm being told, we do not have what we would say is a large majority. We have about a 55% majority who agrees on that we have to have, well, everyone basically, like almost 100% of everybody agrees at the table that we have to have disclosure. The disagreement is on how we're going to do that. So we've got about a 55% of everybody who's participating agreeing on that right now, but we need about closer to 75 or 80% before we can actually do something. So I'd say we're closer than ever, but there's no way for me to say how close or how soon that's actually going to happen. I'd love to see it happen, any day now, but that's not up to me. So fingers crossed, but anytime soon, but that could be anytime next year or in the next few years.
Very good. Now, you said you're going to have a book coming out soon. Is that right?
I do. I'm just basically at the final stages of having my proofreaders proofread the final version that I've done, and when we've made the last final spelling, grammar, punctuation corrections, because trolls are vicious when it comes to that, apparently, as other authors have told me. If you don't have all your punctuation and grammar mistakes taken care of, trolls will just rip you apart. Then I will hand it off to my publisher, and we will get out the ebook and the paper copy, and she's encouraged me to go ahead and do the reading for my own audiobook. So people who want to listen to the audiobook will be able to hear it in my own voice.
Very good. Now, there's tons of questions I didn't get to, so I'm going to definitely have to have you back on. And I want to thank you so much for joining us tonight, Randy. That was a fascinating story.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to share the story with everybody. We think it's important that people understand the truth of where we are. We think it's important that people raise their consciousness to the level of understanding that we are not alone in the universe. And not only are we not alone in the universe, we have a lot of friends and neighbors that we are talking to and trading bits and pieces with on a regular daily basis. So they love our stuff. We make good stuff, apparently. So we've gone from a species that needs a bunch of help from all these extraterrestrials to now we make better stuff than some of the stuff that they make. So we're a major trader and manufacturer of a lot of different high-tech toys and tools, as well as garments and clothing. Terrestrial fashion wear apparently is very popular out there in the galaxy, and people buy a lot of our clothes. And apparently they love our beer. We make great beer. So the two major exports that I'm aware of are beer and children's clothing, which I will have to insert. We don't think is for children. We think it's for ETs who are child size.
Wow, fascinating. Well, Randy, thanks again for joining us. We're going to definitely have to have you back, and you have a great night.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you for having me.